a pain medication, but it has also been used as a recreational drug mixed with heroin or cocaine. China's National Narcotics Control Commission refutes U.S. claims that most of the fentanyl driving America's opioid crisis originate from China, and China is taking tougher measures to control fentanyl-related substances. The Narcotics Control Commission says it has not identified a single case of fentanyl trafficking from the country to the United States since May the 1st. Now, for the latest, let's talk to our correspondent Sun Tianyuan in Beijing. Hello there, Tianyuan. First of all, walk us through some of China's efforts to control fentanyl-related substances.
Well, Dongning, China has tightened regulation and stepped up legislation on fentanyl-related substances. By the end of 2018, a total of 25 fentanyl-related substances were listed as controlled narcotics. The Ministry of Public Safety says it has developed new laws to deal with fentanyl-related crimes, and it will also issue protocols soon for the inspection of the drugs. Meanwhile, police are strengthening technical support by setting up a national network of narcotic labs and implementing special training in the inspection and evaluation of illegal fentanyl-related drugs. The ministry has cracked down on online sales of the drugs in 13 provinces and regions. Police say they have punished companies and individuals involved in drug trafficking and smuggling. And since May, not a single fentanyl-related crime was identified in China. Dongning.
Well, fentanyl abuse has become a global problem indeed. Sun Tianyuan, what is China's stance on handling the problem?
Well, indeed, Dongning, despite China's efforts in fighting fentanyl trafficking, death caused by drug abuse in the U.S. still remains high. In 2017, over 28,000 Americans died of fentanyl abuse. The number rose to 30,000 last year. From October 2018 to March 2019, U.S. Customs has identified 229 fentanyl smuggling cases with a total weight about 530 tons. It's said 17 of the smuggling cases are from China. The office says it is clear that China is not the main source of fentanyl trafficking to the U.S., and neither is the major cause of America's fentanyl crisis. It says it would be irresponsible to blame China. The office adds that China remains firmly committed to its zero tolerance on illegal drugs. It says the country is ready to cooperate with the U.S. and other countries to share intelligence and to address the drug problem. Back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Sun Tianyuan, reporting from Beijing. President Donald Trump says the U.S. is not to blame for its opioid epidemic, but recent court cases have found American pharmaceutical companies are fueling the crisis.
It was once hailed as a feat of modern medicine, but it's now become a scourge, with even the highest levels of the U.S. government calling for action.
The opioid crisis is an emergency, and I'm saying officially right now it is an emergency. It's a national emergency.
Playing a major role in the opioid epidemic, fentanyl, a fast-acting pain reliever and a highly addictive narcotic. What was once prescribed to patients suffering tremendous pain is now flooding the streets, becoming the end of the road for those addicted to opioids and heroin.
About 80% of the active users of fentanyl that we interviewed report that their introduction to opioids was with pills, and that usually a couple years after pill use is when they started transitioning to heroin on average, and then a couple years after transitioning to heroin, on average, people start trying fentanyls.
A surge in deaths caused by opioid overdoses has put drugs like fentanyl and OxyContin in the spotlight. And while Trump is taking aim at China, saying it's behind the epidemic, many states have started to tackle the issue at what they say is the root cause: America's pharmaceutical industry. In August, an Oklahoma judge found pharma giant Johnson & Johnson liable for fueling the state's opioid crisis, ordering them to pay $500 million in damages.
Today, Judge Bachman has affirmed our position that Johnson & Johnson, motivated by greed and avarice, is responsible for the opioid epidemic in our state.
Another company taking heat, and one most often put at the center of the crisis, Purdue Pharma, is seeking to settle more than 2,000 lawsuits over its role in the opioid epidemic. Sources familiar with the case say they're looking at a price tag of as much as $12 billion. And earlier this year, one of America's largest distributors of opioids, McKesson, settled with the state of West Virginia to the tune of $37 million for its role in the opioid epidemic. In 2017, the company also agreed to pay $150 million to federal authorities in a record-breaking settlement for failing to report suspicious prescription drug orders. In 2011, this same company was chosen by the Food and Drug Administration to create a training program for doctors prescribing a specially administered form of fentanyl. Just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the pipelines and revolving doors involved in the industry. Timothy Ulrich, CGTN.
For more analysis on this, we're now joined by Mr. Harvey Zodin. He's a former diplomat for the UN International Narcotics Control Board. Welcome to Global Watch, Harvey. Well, apart from the US companies, the government's own Food and Drug Administration has done little indeed to stop pharmaceutical companies from abusing the use of fentanyl. Despite the rising number of deaths, why do you think the US government is doing that little?
Well, I think it's a lot of the philosophy of this administration. So instead of FDA standing for Food and Drug Administration, as it has for many decades, I think it stands now for fostering drug abuse. Because this administration, the Trump administration, believes in free markets and in no regulation. And so for these kinds of drugs, they need to have heavy regulation because we see the number of deaths involved here. And I'm quite surprised actually at President Trump because he claims to be pro-life. But as the statistics pointed out, as the speaker said previously, last year about 30,000 people alone died of fentanyl overdoses. This is not pro-life. And so I believe it's because of the philosophy of the Trump administration. They'd rather let their constituents, who are the big business, take the money and run. So there's a saying in Washington, I'll clean it up a little bit, but basically it's that money talks and BS walks. And so these companies like J&J and Purdue Pharma, McKesson, they have very high-priced and very effective lobbyists composed of former government regulators, former congresspeople, senators, and so on. They're very effective at blocking the FDA. It's really, as President Trump would say, sad, very sad.
It is sad indeed, but the deaths caused by the fentanyl abuse and also the opioid crisis in the U.S. Is blamed. The blames of all that went straight to China. By doing that, do you think U.S. administration is trying to deflect the attention from the existing problem in its own healthcare system, as Americans account for 5% of the world's population, but they consume actually 80% of the world's opioids?
Well, why should this surprise you? The Trump administration's modus operandi always is to deny responsibility and deflect it elsewhere. China and the U.S. are in a trade war started by the U.S. So China is a very compelling victim here because President Trump has an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. He takes no credit or no responsibility for all these deaths, and he blames China. Whereas President Xi Jinping seems to have done everything he promised to do to President Trump back in December in Buenos Aires, and that was to get stricter enforcement of fentanyl and related drugs. So on May 1st in China, the government has put in a new regime that fentanyl, even if you change one atom of it doesn't need to go through rigorous testing and things. It just will be enforced as if it were fentanyl related. So that completely changes the situation that existed before. And so that's why drug production, illegal drug production of fentanyl and other opiates has moved from Asia and other areas to the southern border. And this is another point. President Trump has taken the people who enforce drug enforcement and do the drug interdiction, try to catch these drugs from coming into the country. He's taken those people away from those duties and put them into stopping innocent women and children from crossing the border, people who are trying to escape from political persecution in Guatemala and other countries.
Thank you very much indeed, Harvey Zodin, a former diplomat for the UN International Narcotics Control Board. Thank you very much for your insight. All right, now let's have another quick look at the facts about fentanyl. McKesson, one of America's largest distributor of opioids, earlier this year settled with the state of West Virginia to the tune of $37 million for its role in the opioid epidemic. In 2011, McKesson was chosen by the U.S. government to monitor abuse of these drugs by pharma companies, which many say is a direct conflict of interest. In 2017, the same company agreed to pay $150 million to federal authorities for failing to report suspicious prescription drug orders. United States Customs says there were 229 cases of fentanyl trafficking between last October and March this year. Only 17 were from China, and it adds that 536 kilograms of fentanyl was seized, and of that, 5.8 kilograms came from China. Just a 1.1 portion of the whole of the total amount. All right, you're now watching Global Watch on CGTN. Now let's check out how the stock markets and also the business world is going. Let's talk to my colleague Guan Xin. Hello there.
Thanks, Tony. Well, let's start with a look at Asian stock markets on this Tuesday. Trading was tepid today without Wall Street lead, and the U.S. market closed on Monday for holiday. Investors are closely watching the Reserve Bank of Australia's rate decision due later today. And for more details on that, joining me now are Timothy Pope in Shanghai and Melanie Raff in Singapore. Good to see you, folks. And team, starting with you, trade, Brexit, the global economy, there's a lot for investors to stress about at the moment, and it seems to be impacted